October in Florida is a gardener's paradise. With cooler temperatures and fewer pests, now is the time to get your hands in the dirt. In this video, I'll be sharing exactly what you should be planting right now. If you're ready to take advantage of the best gardening season of the year, stick around. And you don't want to miss the last chapter where I'm going to talk through everything you should be doing this month to prep for November and December. Let's get into it. First, let's talk about leafy greens and your big brassicas. So crops like arugula and kale and spinach that are really fast growing, you can start right away in the month of October. Last year when I planted a lot of these leafy greens, I direct sowed them in my garden and actually had some really negative effects from doing that. There were a few different days where I'd come out to check on my seedlings and all of a sudden the seedlings had disappeared overnight. I suspect some type of bug or bird had walked off with that seedling, but it was very frustrating. So what I want to recommend you do with leafy greens is either buy transplants or start them from seed in a seed starting cell. Let me show you, these are my kale starts that I started about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and you can see just how delicate they are. This is a lacinato kale, which I highly recommend. It's really fun to grow. It looks really cool. And the leaves are a little flatter than a curly kale, which makes it much easier to spot some pest issues. Another leafy green I started from seed is arugula. Now arugula is very fast growing, so you could just overseed it and direct sow and handle it that way. But for me, I went ahead and started it in a seed starting cell so I could carefully transplant it into the garden once my garden was ready. Another reason you might want to choose starting from seeds in a seed starting cell is if you're choosing a specific variety of that leafy green that you can't just find as a transplant at the store. Now within the leafy greens and brassica category, we have some really fun crops. So we've got our Brussels sprout. I will link a video right here of my first ever harvest of a Brussels sprout crop. And it was pretty eye-opening to, like a lot of my family members and any guests that came over to my house, they were shocked at the way that a Brussels sprout grows. So it's on this big stalk, and then the sprouts just kind of form on this big stem. And another thing I loved about growing Brussels sprouts was finding out that even these large leaves that grow on the side of the plant all the way up the stem are edible as well. But Brussels sprout leaves are not something that you can just find at your local grocery store and make at home. So it was fun to experience that too. Also, don't forget about growing broccoli and cabbage. Now when it comes to cabbage, you're gonna wanna think about how you plan to use the cabbage. So there's the traditional green cabbage, and then there's the red cabbage that you can grow, and those are sometimes used in like a sauerkraut recipe or in like a slaw that you might put on top of some type of taco. But if you're gonna grow cabbage with the intent to make kimchi, don't forget to buy your Napa cabbage seeds. Napa cabbage is what's traditionally used in a kimchi. So I have a few starts of Brussels sprouts, broccoli, and collards that I've started. They're a little bit leggy, so I'm gonna have to deal with that when it comes time to transplant, but I think I can make it work. But what I want you to think about is how long it takes to grow these crops. If you look at the days to harvest for something like a Brussels sprout, it's almost 120 days. But here in Florida, we can grow those crops basically from now until February. So this is a prime candidate for succession sowing. I love to cook roasted Brussels sprouts, and so I want to harvest from more than one Brussels sprout crop this year. So I'm going to be planting one every 2 weeks so that approximately every 2 weeks I can harvest from a Brussels sprout plant. In October, we need to be planting our leafy greens for our salad veggies. We need to be planting a lot of our brassicas, and we also need to be planting our annual herbs. Our annual herbs are the ones like cilantro, dill, sage, parsley, the ones that won't last an entire year. This is the time to start planting them. However, you're still going to want to think about whether you're going to direct sow, seed start in a seed starting cell, or buy transplants for those herbs. If you're planting those herbs at the same time as something like a cucumber, like you want your cucumber and your dill growing side by side so you get the pest deterrent properties of the dill, you're going to want to consider how fast they grow. If you were to direct sow a cucumber seed right now, it will sprout really quickly. But if you were to direct sow a dill seed right next to it, that dill wouldn't even sprout for 3 weeks. So your cucumber is going to have like a 3-week head start on your dill if you did it like that. So if you want to plant them at the same time, consider buying a transplant of your dill to give you a little bit of a head start. I prefer to start my herbs in a seed starting cell because they take so long and I can kind of control that environment a lot better than I can out in the garden. And it's also a lot more cost effective. Like one of these seed packets, for example, dill, it's like listed as $2.29 for a whole bunch of dill seeds. But a transplant of dill is probably $3, $4, something like that for just one plant. So it's definitely more cost effective if you started it from seed, and I would caution you against putting it directly in the garden just because it's really hard to control that environment for something like a tiny little herb seed. Now let's talk about fruiting plants. One of my favorite plants that I look forward to growing every year is strawberries. Florida is actually the biggest producer of winter strawberries in the United States. So they grow really well here from about October to April or May. However, strawberries are not something that you start from seed. You are going to have to buy bare root strawberries or strawberry transplants. 2 months ago, I ordered my strawberry starts from Whitwam Organics, and they should arrive this month, so I'm going to be planting my strawberries in a vertical tower this month. Hit that subscribe button if you're interested in that video, and I will publish it as soon as I get those bare root strawberries in the mail. Now, if you haven't ordered strawberry starts online, don't worry, it's very likely that your local nursery will get some strawberry starts anytime now. Last year, I remember I was calling Rockledge Gardens Nursery almost every day between September 15th and October 15th, trying to make sure I could get my hands on strawberries. And as soon as they came in, I went over to the nursery and I bought them. You can also get bare root starts or regular transplants from a big box store like Lowe's or Home Depot. The downside of not ordering ahead is that you have a little bit less say in which specific variety you actually get to plant. Now let's talk about our large fruiting crops like tomatoes, eggplants, and cucumbers and squashes. We really probably should have started the seeds last month, which is what I did. But if you haven't, you can still go to your local nursery or big box store and get your hands on some transplants to put in the garden. What I've chosen to do this year is stay away from the indeterminate tomato types, just because I have a really hard time managing them in my garden. Indeterminate tomatoes will grow like crazy, and you really have to make sure that you have the trellis space available to support them, or you're going to be heavily pruning them almost every day. I swear those indeterminate tomatoes will grow so fast. A determinate type of tomato grows more in like a bush-like form, and it's perfect for something like a tomato cage. One of my favorites that I grew last year was a determinate San Marzano tomato. It was very productive, so I'll put a link in the description box below to this variety along with some other specific varieties. Peppers are also a fun one to start right now. I should warn you, they're a little bit slow at the very beginning, so it might be worth it to you to just buy a start. Something like a shishito pepper has done really well in my garden here in Melbourne, Florida, so I highly recommend getting a shishito pepper. And if you've ever sauteed them with a little salt and garlic, you know how good they are. Bell peppers. This past season, I grew a California Wonder bell pepper. It did okay, but I've heard Carolina Wonder does better because it's resistant to root knot nematodes, which is a common pest that we have here. So I'll put a link in the description box to a Carolina Wonder bell pepper that I plan to order and plant myself. If you enjoy eating eggplant, I would plant one right now. My eggplant last year was so productive. I had way more eggplant than I even wanted to eat. So if you're only mildly interested in growing eggplant, I would absolutely recommend only one plant. Now is a good time to buy some starts for any of the squashes that you're interested in growing. I will say that these are some of the most challenging crops to grow in Florida. They are heavy feeders. They need a lot of nutrients and they need a lot of water. And they're also very susceptible to disease like powdery mildew that we get really commonly here. There are some varieties that are resistant to some of those diseases. For example, this is a South Anna butternut squash that I harvested from the last time I grew South Anna butternut squash, and I picked up the seeds from Southern Exposure. I will say I still had disease pressure when I planted those in the spring, but they were still productive despite the disease and pest pressure. Now let's talk about root veggies. I think root veggies are my favorite. It's so much fun for me and my kids to pull them up out of the garden and see how big they are. So this year I'm growing a Carota carrot. I'll probably also plant some Danvers carrots, which is just a short and stubby style carrot. But keep in mind, carrots take like 4 months from seed to harvest. So make sure you're planting carrots often. I'm going to direct sow some seeds today in the garden, and then I'm going to just keep planting them at least every 2 weeks. And I think I'm probably going to have to buy some more seeds. I'll probably run out. But that's okay. I might try some purple varieties or something like that. Beets are another root veggie that you can start. Beets are actually a more unique root veggie because they supposedly do well being transplanted. So I got a head start on mine. I started them a couple weeks ago indoors in a seed starting cell, and I'm going to transplant here shortly. This is the Early Wonder variety from Botanical Interests, but I also got a Golden Beet variety from Jera's Garden too, and I'll put links in the description box below to those seeds. Now the next one I want to talk about is not exactly classified as a root veggie, but I guess they call it a brassica, but it's kohlrabi. Kohlrabi actually is like a swollen stem that you harvest. You should be able to transplant kohlrabi, so I started them from seed a couple weeks ago. Some people call it the alien of the garden. It looks kind of crazy when it's growing, but I like the fact that you can see it above ground, and last year I had 0 pest pressure on my kohlrabi, so I think this is one that's going to go really well this year. Now let's talk about beans. Beans are some of the easiest crops to grow. The seeds can be directly sown, and the seeds are so big, which makes it really easy to sow them. Now if you're unfamiliar with growing beans, you'll see pole beans and bush beans. Bush beans have a bush growing habit, which means they'll be short and wide, and sometimes they just need a little bit of a support like a bamboo stake, but nothing really major. A pole bean, however, is a vining variety that's going to get really, really long. People put them on the arched trellises that they have and other really big trellises. So make sure if you choose a pole bean type that you have the trellis space for it. Personally, I haven't figured out a great way to do the trellising in my backyard, so I'm going to reserve the trellis space for the vining fruiting crops, and I'm going to go with a bush bean. The Blue Lake bush bean is just your traditional green bean, and my kids love that. It's really fun for my kids to pick them and then cook them and eat them, so I'm going to go with those ones this year. If you're like me and you're experiencing some root knot nematode issues in your garden, there's also a nemagreen lima bean that's resistant to root knot nematodes. I have one raised bed that clearly has a nematode issue, so I'm going to plant the nemagreen lima beans in that raised bed. If you're unfamiliar with root knot nematodes and you're interested in learning about what that is, check out my most recent video about root knot nematodes. Flowers are so important to have in a vegetable garden, especially if you're trying to naturally bring in the pollinators for your large fruiting crops. Some of the flowers I recommend putting in your garden in the month of October is going to be a snapdragon. I got this beautiful red variety from Botanical Interests. And then dianthus. I got 2 different types of dianthus. One is a sweet William and one is a carnation. Again, I got those from Botanical Interests. And then a petunia. I got a purple and a white tie-dye petunia. I think that'll look really cool in the raised bed right next to the dark red snapdragons. One of the things I've noticed about gardening is if you're not on top of planning, meaning you're not looking 2 to 3 months in advance of what you need to plant, you could wind up unprepared when that time comes. So I want to dedicate this chapter to what you should be doing or buying right now to be ready for gardening in November and December. October is the time when you're going to start seeing things all over Instagram and all over your YouTube feed about planting garlic. But here in Florida and other southern states, right now is the time when we're receiving our seed garlic and we're putting it in the fridge for the vernalization stage. This is absolutely critical for growing garlic in Florida. Vernalization just means putting the seed garlic in the fridge for 6 to 8 weeks to simulate cold temperatures outside. This is absolutely critical for growing garlic in Florida because our temperatures don't get low enough. I neglected to do this step last year, and you can watch my garlic failure video right here. My garlic was awful. After growing it for 9 months, it barely produced anything. So this year I'm doing it better. I just received my seed garlic from Keen Garlic. I got the Inchelium Red soft neck variety, and I got the Purple Creole variety as well. And as soon as I received them in the mail, I stuck them in the fridge, and I'm about to go put them right back in the fridge. If you haven't ordered seed garlic yet, and you intend to grow garlic this year, I highly recommend buying it right now. We are going to be planting that garlic in the garden in late November or early December. Another crop you may want to grow that requires some forethought is bulbing onions. Now this year I've chosen to start from seed in a seed starting cell. However, I am definitely having some trouble. I've lost some of the seeds to damping off. Some of them are still doing okay. For example, this one you can see some are doing okay and some are damping off. So what I've done is I've also ordered onion sets from Haas.com. I got the Texas 1015 variety, which is a nice short day onion, which should do really well. Ordering the onion sets for me is really my backup plan, and it looks like I'm probably going to wind up using a mixture of my own starts and some of those onion sets from Haas. If you haven't ordered your onion sets yet, I would recommend doing a little research figuring out which variety you want. Haas.com has great short day varieties for white onions, yellow onions, and red onions. So take a look over there and see if you can find what you're looking for. Here in Florida, we're going to end up planting our bulbing onions into the garden in about November. Irish potatoes are another crop that we're going to end up planting in November or December. Last year, I bought Yukon Gold potatoes from the grocery store and I just let them sprout in the pantry and then I planted those and it worked out pretty well. This year, however, I'm going to source some certified seed potatoes just to make sure that they're disease-free and they haven't been sprayed with any sprout inhibitors. So my recommendation in the month of October is either to order your seed potatoes or buy them from the grocery store so you can let them get ready to sprout. What we're going to do is plant sprouted potatoes in November. Hope you guys enjoyed that video. Hit that subscribe button and follow along. I'd love to hear in the comments below what you're planning to start in your garden this year, and I hope we all have a great gardening season.